If you knew that the words you speak every single day are quietly shaping your health, your strength, and even the way your body functions, you would probably become far more careful with your speech than you are right now. Because the uncomfortable truth is that most people are not destroyed suddenly by one big moment, but slowly by repeated words they barely notice anymore. Many only realize the damage when it is already advanced, when years have passed chasing doctors, changing treatments, trying different medications, and moving from one specialist to another, yet never once stopping to pay attention to the constant dialogue they maintain with themselves. And that is where the real problem begins, because while they are praying for healing, they are also speaking destruction over their own lives every single day without even noticing it. While they ask God for a miracle, they are simultaneously giving their body instructions to weaken, collapse, and shut down through their own language. And what makes this even more serious is that the body does not treat these words as harmless emotions, but as signals it is designed to obey. Think about how often people say things like, "I am finished," "I have no strength left," "My body is breaking down," or "I will never recover." In the moment, these may feel like simple expressions of frustration, just words released during exhaustion or emotional pressure, something temporary that should not matter. But the body does not interpret them as casual comments. It receives them as direction, as internal programming, almost like commands that must be followed. Every repeated statement becomes part of a pattern that the nervous system begins to recognize and respond to. Over time, what starts as a passing complaint can slowly turn into a lived reality, not because the words have magical power, but because repetition influences mindset, behavior, stress levels, and biological responses in ways most people never consider. This is where the deeper and more unsettling truth appears. The human body, in a spiritual sense, is designed to respond to authority, and the first authority it consistently listens to is your own voice. Not just the words you say out loud, but also the constant internal conversation you have with yourself when no one else is around. That is why two people can face similar health challenges, similar environments, and even similar levels of medical support, yet experience completely different outcomes over time. One continues to reinforce hope, patience, and resilience in their inner dialogue, while the other slowly builds a mental environment filled with defeat, fear, and self-criticism. The difference is not always external circumstances, but the internal language that shapes how the body reacts to stress and recovery. This is also why so many people begin to decline from within, even when they have access to doctors, resources, and supportive families. On the outside, everything may appear stable, but internally they are constantly feeding themselves thoughts of failure. They wake up already tired before the day even begins. They look in the mirror and immediately focus on what is wrong, what has changed, what feels broken. They insult their own bodies, criticize their age, and speak against their limitations as if their identity is defined by decline. Then they wonder why, year after year, they feel weaker, more hopeless, and less alive inside. It is not only the physical condition that is changing, but the continuous mental environment they are creating through their own words and thoughts, which slowly influences how they experience their health, energy, and emotional stability. And this is exactly where a completely different understanding becomes important, because the same principle that can contribute to decline can also become a path toward restoration. The words that weaken the body can also become the words that begin to rebuild it. The thoughts that silently damage internal balance can also activate a process of healing that many people never thought possible. This is not about superstition or magical thinking, but about a deeper principle that connects the mind, the spirit, and the body in ways that have been observed for centuries and are only now being better understood. It is the idea that what you repeatedly believe and speak eventually shapes how you experience your own physical reality, for better or for worse. At the center of this understanding lies a principle that has been present since the beginning of creation itself. It is not presented as a suggestion, but as a reality that carries weight in both spiritual and human experience. Scripture says that life and death are in the power of the tongue, and many people read that statement as a simple metaphor, something poetic meant to inspire careful speech. But if you observe human behavior closely, it begins to look less like symbolism and more like a consistent law. Words shape direction, and direction shapes outcomes. What we repeatedly speak does not remain trapped in sound alone. It slowly influences perception, decision-making, emotional stability, and even the way the body responds to stress and recovery over time. Every word carries influence, not in a mystical or exaggerated sense, but in the practical way it trains the mind to interpret reality. When someone constantly speaks defeat, the mind begins to filter experiences through that lens, noticing problems more than possibilities. When someone repeatedly declares weakness, the body starts to operate under a constant expectation of limitation, often reflected in posture, energy levels, and stress responses. And when negative self-talk becomes a daily habit, it stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like identity. That is how many people unknowingly build an internal environment that works against their own healing, while still believing they are simply describing their situation honestly. There was a moment shared with a woman some years ago that revealed this truth in a very direct way. When she entered the room, it was already clear she had been carrying something heavy for a long time. Her movements were slow, her posture was broken, and even before she sat down, her words began to reflect a deep internal collapse. She said she was shattered, that her body no longer worked properly, that she was a burden to others, and that she could not continue anymore. It was not just physical exhaustion she was describing, but a complete sense of internal defeat that had been reinforced over years. As she spoke, it became clear that her condition was not only related to illness, but also to the way she had been speaking about herself for a long time without interruption. In that moment, a difficult realization appeared. Many people are not only struggling against physical conditions, they are also living under the constant weight of their own repeated declarations. What they say about themselves begins to shape how they see themselves, and eventually how they respond to life itself. When someone continuously describes their body as broken, their mind stops looking for repair and starts expecting decline. When every conversation about oneself becomes negative, even hope starts to feel unfamiliar and distant. This is how language quietly becomes part of the illness itself, not as the cause of every disease, but as a factor that influences how deeply a person experiences suffering. This is why a shift in understanding becomes so important. The same system that can be damaged through repeated negative input can also begin to recover when the input changes. If constant criticism can weaken a person internally, then consistent words of truth, patience, and gratitude can gradually begin to restore balance. The change does not always appear instantly or dramatically. Instead, it begins in small internal adjustments, where the mind slowly stops attacking the body and starts acknowledging it differently. Over time, this shift can influence stress levels, emotional stability, and even physical responses that are closely connected to the nervous system and overall well-being. This connection between language, thought, and physical response is not presented as a replacement for medicine or care, but as an additional layer of understanding that many overlook. Human beings are not divided into separate compartments where the body functions independently from emotion and thought. Instead, there is a continuous interaction between what is believed, what is spoken, and how the body reacts over time. And when that interaction is consistently negative, the results often reflect decline. But when it begins to shift towards stability, hope, and constructive thinking, the system responds in ways that can support healing rather than resistance. This is exactly where the deeper truth begins to reveal itself, because the way a person speaks to themselves is often more powerful than anything spoken to them by others. There are people who have spent years surrounded by care, medicine, and support, yet internally they continue to destroy themselves through constant negative self-talk. They may receive encouragement from doctors, comfort from family, and reassurance from friends, but if their inner dialogue remains filled with defeat, none of those external voices fully take root. Over time, the mind begins to prioritize the internal narrative over everything else, and that internal narrative slowly becomes the framework through which the body and emotions operate. There was a woman who once came forward to share her experience, and from the moment she entered, it was clear that she had been living under a heavy emotional burden for a long time. Her steps were weak, her presence felt drained, and even before she fully explained her situation, her words began to reveal a deep sense of internal collapse. She repeatedly described herself as broken, useless, and beyond repair. She spoke as if every part of her identity had already been lost, and what remained was only exhaustion. As she continued speaking, it became evident that her suffering was not only physical, but also deeply shaped by years of internal repetition of the same painful beliefs about herself. What stood out in that moment was not just her condition, but the realization that many people unknowingly reinforce their own suffering through language. When a person constantly describes themselves as weak or defeated, that description does not remain neutral. It begins to influence behavior, posture, emotional responses, and even willingness to seek recovery. The mind starts to align itself with the identity it hears most often, and the body follows that pattern in subtle but continuous ways. This is how repeated words slowly become part of lived experience, shaping not only how a person feels, but also how they interpret every new challenge. And yet, within this same reality lies an equally powerful possibility. If repeated negative language can contribute to internal decline, then a shift in language can also open the door to restoration. When a person begins to speak differently about themselves, even in small and hesitant ways, something inside them begins to respond. It may not be immediate, and it may not feel dramatic at first, but over time the mind starts to adjust to this new pattern. Words of patience, gratitude, and hope begin to replace constant self-criticism, and this gradual shift allows the nervous system and emotional state to move away from constant tension and toward stability. This is not about denying reality or ignoring pain. It is about changing the way pain is interpreted and expressed internally. A person can acknowledge suffering without turning it into identity. They can recognize difficulty without declaring defeat. And this distinction is critical, because when suffering becomes identity, recovery feels impossible. But when suffering is seen as a condition rather than a definition, it opens the possibility for change. That shift alone can influence how a person engages with treatment, relationships, and even their own will to continue. Over time, this change in internal language begins to create a different environment within the mind and body. Stress responses become less constant, emotional reactions become more balanced, and the sense of being trapped slowly begins to weaken. It does not erase challenges, but it changes the internal strength with which those challenges are faced. And in many cases, that shift becomes the starting point of a much deeper process of healing that involves both the physical and emotional dimensions of a person's life. At this point, a crucial question naturally arises. Why do so many people remain trapped in patterns of suffering even when change seems possible? The answer often lies in how deeply identity becomes tied to pain. When someone has lived for years with a certain condition, struggle, or emotional wound, it no longer feels like something they are experiencing. It begins to feel like who they are. The language they use about themselves reflects this shift. Instead of saying, "I am going through something difficult," they begin to say, "This is who I am now." And once suffering becomes identity, letting go of it feels almost like losing a part of oneself, even if that part is painful. This is where many people unknowingly resist their own healing. They may consciously say they want to recover, but internally they remain attached to the familiar structure of their pain. It is not that they prefer suffering, but that it has become familiar, predictable, and deeply integrated into how they understand themselves. Even hope can feel uncomfortable when a person has spent too long expecting disappointment. That is why transformation often requires more than just medical treatment or external change. It requires a reconstruction of self-perception, where a person learns to exist without constantly defining themselves through their wounds. There was a moment shared with a man who had been dealing with a serious illness for a long time, and what he expressed revealed this struggle clearly. He said that his body felt like it had betrayed him, as if it had turned against him without reason. But in response, a difficult truth became clear. His body was not the enemy, but something that had been carrying him through years of emotional and psychological pressure. Over time, his internal world had been filled with criticism, anger, and despair, and even though medical treatment was ongoing, his emotional state had already surrendered long before his body showed signs of improvement or decline. When he began to reflect more deeply on his own words and thoughts, a shift slowly started to take place. Instead of constantly describing his condition as a death sentence, he began to reframe his internal dialogue. He started acknowledging that he was still alive, still fighting, still capable of response. These were not exaggerated affirmations, but simple truths he had stopped recognizing. Each morning, he began to speak more consciously about his situation, not denying reality, but refusing to interpret it through complete defeat. Over time, this subtle change in language began to influence how he experienced his days, his emotions, and even his physical endurance during treatment. This is where the distinction between recognizing pain and surrendering to it becomes essential. A person can fully acknowledge that they are suffering without turning that suffering into a permanent identity. They can say, "I am in pain," without saying, "I am broken." They can admit, "I am struggling," without concluding, "I am finished." This difference may seem small in language, but internally it creates a completely different psychological and emotional response. One statement allows movement and possibility, while the other creates stagnation and limitation. As this understanding deepens, it becomes clear that healing is not only about removing symptoms, but also about changing the internal environment in which those symptoms are experienced. When a person begins to speak to themselves with more awareness, less hostility, and greater honesty, the body often responds in ways that reflect reduced internal tension. Stress levels shift, emotional weight begins to feel lighter, and the constant sense of internal conflict slowly starts to decrease. It is not an instant transformation, but a gradual reorganization of how the mind and body respond to life itself, opening space for recovery where there was once only resistance. At the deepest level of this entire discussion, one reality becomes impossible to ignore. Many people are not only carrying physical conditions, but also carrying long-standing emotional and mental burdens that continuously influence how those conditions are experienced. The body often reflects what the mind has been holding for years, especially when fear, resentment, and hopelessness are never truly addressed. In such cases, even when treatment is available, the internal environment remains in a constant state of tension, making recovery feel slower, heavier, and more exhausting than it might otherwise be. This is why so many individuals appear to improve temporarily, but then fall back into the same cycle of fatigue and distress. The external approach is often addressed, but the internal dialogue remains unchanged. A person may follow medical advice, take medication, and attend therapy, yet still continue speaking to themselves in a way that reinforces defeat. When the inner narrative does not shift, the body remains under continuous emotional pressure, as if it is never fully allowed to exit a state of alertness. Over time, this becomes a silent factor that affects overall well-being far more than most people realize. There are also cases where people unknowingly live in a constant state of emotional conflict, not because of what is happening around them, but because of what continues happening within them. Past experiences are replayed repeatedly in the mind, old wounds are reinterpreted again and again, and unresolved emotions are carried forward into each new day. This internal repetition creates a psychological loop that keeps the nervous system engaged in stress responses, even when there is no immediate external threat. As a result, the body behaves as though it is still under pressure, even in moments that should be safe or calm. At the same time, something important becomes clear when observing those who gradually begin to recover. It is often not only a change in treatment or circumstance that makes the difference, but a change in how they relate to their own experience. When a person begins to speak differently about their life, even in small and gradual ways, the internal atmosphere begins to shift. Instead of constantly reinforcing fear or defeat, they begin to acknowledge progress, however small it may be. Instead of defining themselves entirely through struggle, they begin to recognize moments of strength, resilience, or simply survival. These subtle changes in perception slowly influence emotional stability and overall mental clarity. This does not mean that pain disappears or that challenges are instantly resolved. Rather, it means that the way pain is carried begins to change. A person may still face difficulty, but they no longer interpret every experience as confirmation of permanent decline. They begin to separate identity from circumstance, and that separation creates space for recovery. When suffering is no longer the core definition of who a person is, it loses some of its power to shape every thought, reaction, and expectation about the future. Ultimately, what emerges from all of this is a simple but profound understanding. Healing is not only a physical process, but also an internal transformation. The way a person speaks to themselves, interprets their experiences, and understands their identity plays a significant role in how they move through suffering. When internal language shifts from